Hello and welcome back to the second half of our Queer and AI workshop at ICML 2020. And next up, we've got a talk by Manuel Sabin on queer and AI, moral injury and going beyond resilience. Over to Manuel.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Manuel, they, them, and yeah, this is queer and AI, and the queer is in quotes, but I guess the emphasis I mean to be on the in, what it means to be queer within the field of AI, within the area of AI. And I want to kind of get a sense of meaning of queer, what it means to be queer within AI. And I'll be talking about my experience in academia, kind of moving queerly through it. It'll be a talk about mostly kind of systemic components of it, but that's just because the systemic is personal to me, namely because the systemic has given me a framework and words to understand the personal that I experienced as I experienced it. Yeah, so I'll just start it off and maybe some of it helps too. So, you know, queer, what is it? I mean, it's a reclaimed slur used against non-heterosexual people. And it's a slur because its original meaning was, you know, strange, odd, not quite right. If you look at Merriam-Webster, it's differing in some way from what is usual or normal. Right? So when weaponized as a slur, it says we are wrong, that we are outside the lines, or as kind of Shakir quoted Audre Lorde, we are on the shorelines. And kind of the first thing I want to understand as I start understanding what it means to be outside of the lines is whose lines? If we're outside of the lines, whose? And there's this comedian I was watching the other day on YouTube, Yedoye Trevis. He was talking about white privilege. And when I talk about being outside of the lines, it's hard for me to separate the ways I'm marginalized along axes of race, gender, and sexuality because they intersect so often and compound. So I'll be talking about being queer a lot, but also as I talk about being outside the lines, that'll intersect with race a bit as well, my own race. But so this comedian, he explained white privilege. His explanation is, in X-Men, you know, when Magneto just walks out over open air and a bridge forms under his feet. So, you know, if you've seen the movie, it's you know, basically this, that a bridge just forms under your feet as you walk over it. In the movie, this is a supervillain that can control metal. So that's how that happens in the movie, but it's not important here. But the important part is, you know, some of the folks here may experience white privilege. But I really want to focus kind of on what Yedoye says next, which he says, you know, when you just go somewhere that you've never been and suddenly there's infrastructure. And this notion of infrastructure is what I want to focus on when we ask whose lines we are outside of, right? So a fairly recent famous example in the United States of kind of infrastructure for some people, but not for others, is when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, first got into office. Her salary, she didn't have a salary for 3 months before she started as a congressperson. And she had to bridge that 3-month pay gap. And, you know, this is her commenting on that, you know, just the many of the little ways in which our electoral system isn't even designed for working class people like her to lead, because it's designed for people that don't need a salary for 3 months and can start that way. So I want to talk about some infrastructure in academia now, though, because it's what I've thought most about and kind of what I've passed through. And when I was invited to give a talk here, I had my diversity statement that I have up on my website quoted at me and was asked to talk about my experience in academia being queer, since it may resonate with some of this community. And the first few sentences of my diversity statement is this: a student has to be able to see that they can succeed as themselves. If their faces are not reflected, if their values are not reflected, if their culture is not reflected, then they will begin to hide pieces of themselves. They will not feel attached to academia or their success in it. So as I talk about some of my experiences through academia and computer science, yeah, this will be my experiences. Feel free to type anything you want in the Rocket chat. I don't think in this full screen mode I can see the Zoom chat, but feel free to type anything there. But I'm gonna ask, if I say something that sounds like I've looked into your life and I'm telling your story, please just put a minus sign or hyphen in the chat if it was a painful part of that story, and a plus if it's a part of your story that was positive. So as I kind of go through, if it feels like it's accurate story, go ahead and put a plus or minus whether it's painful or positive. I'm gonna just try to eke out what kind of participation I can out of this weird remote Zoom thing. I think I would do this talk a lot differently in person, but this is the world right now. So yeah, so for infrastructures and lines in academia, one simple example is kind of as we know very well that speaking English allows you to kind of walk through the world with ease as a global scholar. And we'll look at some more here. So in the lines of what academia is there room to grieve? Like how much room do we have to grieve in academia? Can you take 2 months off after a family's death without feeling pressure? So there may not be much room to grieve in general, but like, what about community grieving, especially? If we're maybe seeing some understanding for this, maybe the first time that I know of for a non-white community being given to the Black community during this global uprising. But by and large, there is just not, as individualistic as academia is, we are not given room to grieve for our community as they're kind of consistently assaulted and hurt. Is there room to take action? Any action that doesn't go towards a publication, say protesting. Do we have room to do that? Or are we forced to choose between career productivity and our values and what we hold as important to us? So like, which identities have their values pitted against each other by the structural values and incentives of academia? And which other identities don't? Which identities already mesh with academia's values? So again, whose lines? Do we have room to form community? Some people can find most all of their community amongst their colleagues within academia. Which identities need to find their community outside of academia because their community isn't represented within academia? For example, there's the two-body problem, having a partner move with you to a new job, to a new institution. It's notoriously hard, but there are many attempts to support it where, you'll have a department try to convince another department to hire your spouse, possibly. Like they really try to help with the two-body problem. But what about a multi-body problem? What if you have multiple partners, or if you have a chosen family? Community can be much more rare and sacred thing for marginalized communities, especially queer communities, if they're not accepted by their biological families. And if it was the norm to have a multi-body problem, like if the multi-body problem was the norm, there would be efforts to support it in the same way there are efforts to support a nuclear families moving, kind of what like Ida was touching on earlier. And again, so who draws these lines? Basically, these lines, these infrastructures outline lives that can fit within them. They define which lives pass easily through them and which do not. And these infrastructures consistently tell me that my existence is a squeaky wheel. If I speak up, that is, then I am an inconvenience that just happens to keep finding myself outside of the boundaries of that infrastructure in their eyes. But having this perspective has been helpful for me, at least. It's let me say, oh, that thing that was painful to me was actually systemic. And many of my queer, trans, and POC community would go through that same type of pain if they were allowed in academia in the first place, past the systemic barriers. And many of the dominant group would not go through that pain. Seeing myself in this larger context was very validating, but there was something very painful about it too. And I found a name for this pain that's been pretty useful to me. So I'm going to talk about that for a moment. And this thing is moral injury. This is notion put forth in this paper. So this paper introduces the idea of moral injury, and it was introduced to say that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, did not capture a common type of trauma experienced by war veterans. And what they kind of talk about moral injury as in this paper is this, that moral injury is perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that deeply transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So even this learning about acts can have deep moral injury, which is very contrasted with PTSD, which is usually kind of thought to be a definitive traumatic experience that you're present for, and largely the symptoms are fear. This is a shattering of a worldview, or as Diane Silver in a different article says, it is a deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity, sense of morality, and relationship to society. Why am I talking about this? Well, I'm bringing it up here because it's been talked about in the medical community as a way to dispel this kind of monochromatic narrative of physicians burning out, saying that they're not burning out, and kind of framing it as burning out. This article argues is kind of victim blaming, that it is blaming the physicians for not being resilient enough, or maybe they could have done more self-care to alleviate the burnout. When the real harm is systemic, it is moral injury. And for the medical industrial complex, this is kind of what they have to say on it. Oops. This is from the paper. It says, most physicians enter medicine following a calling rather than a career path. They go into the field with a desire to help people. Many approach it with almost a religious zeal, enduring lost sleep, lost years of young adulthood, huge opportunity costs, family strain, financial instability, so on. In an increasingly business-oriented and profit-driven healthcare environment, physicians must consider a multitude of factors other than their patient's best interests when deciding on treatments. Navigating an ethical path among such intensely competing drivers is emotionally and morally exhausting. Continually being caught between the Hippocratic Oath, a decade of training, and the realities of making a profit from people at their sickest and most vulnerable is untenable and an unreasonable demand. Right, and this is another piece of this article, that physicians are smart, tough, durable, resourceful people. If there was a way to MacGyver themselves out of this situation by working harder, smarter, or differently, they would have done it already. Many physicians contemplate leaving healthcare altogether, but most do not for a variety of reasons: little cross-training for alternative careers, debt, and a commitment to their calling. And so they stay wounded, disengaged, and increasingly hopeless. So yeah, part of this feels familiar to me. The narrative here is a community largely going into a field as their calling, wanting to help the world and people, become disillusioned by the realities of a massive privatized system and many capitalistic incentives that may not actually be doing the help they originally wanted and may actually be causing harm. This is painful and worldview shattering, and familiar. It's also been talked about more generally as, working under incompetent or toxic leadership and kind of seeing the system you'll work under corrupt or just broken in some ways. I think many people now, even heteronormative people in the dominant classes in the United States, especially, well, in many places are feeling this in current times. But moral injury has been a useful term to me because, coming in as a fresh out of undergrad, just, academia was supposed to be a haven, right? A place I could keep learning forever and be valued for it. I wasn't, it was supposed to be a haven with my idols there. I wasn't supposed to have multiple Turing Award winners invalidate my identities and the pain that comes with them. This wasn't what was supposed to happen, whatever that means. And I've lost role models and mentors and, dreams of what academia could be. And if I did quit, would I be seen as not being able to cut it, as burning out? Because I know this is not burnout. I don't need resilience. I need my values reflected in my field. And, feel free to answer this question if you feel like it in the chat. Have you ever been morally injured? If so, how? But yeah. So
we've got one comment about massive privatized system and capitalist pressures.
Okay.
With a big
In the Zoom chat, I don't think I can see that without Xing it out of
Rocket chat. Yeah.
Oh, I don't think I'm seeing that.
That's okay. I'll just pass them on here.
Okay, yeah. I'm not sure why I don't see that. Sorry. Yeah, I have it open right here, but yeah, okay. It just popped up now. So in the time I was processing all this, I saw this book in a store and was immediately drawn to it. I was trying to learn a bit about community organizing at the time too, which is what this book is about, by Charlene Carruthers of the Black Youth Project 100. And we should take a moment to acknowledge how much what liberation we do have as a queer community comes from the Black community, especially Black women. And for those that don't know their queer history, I'm kind of US centric here, especially Black trans women community. And this also goes for much of kind of the political theory, terminology, and culture we have as a general queer culture. And we've just learned to be unapologetic from those who are so hyper marginalized that they have no choice. And this is kind of my state here. This book, I was interested in community organizing, but what drew me to it was just this single word title, unapologetic, which resonated immediately because I think it was something I was circling around a bit, and something I needed deeply at the time. And unapologetic to me, it's been useful, a very useful and empowering concept, because it lets me see that being outside the lines lets me see the system from the outside. I can see the system and voice myself about it unapologetically. My emotional intelligence affects my research and how I see it relate to the world. My lived experience lets me see who machine learning serves, and as recalculatory centers, how it distributes power in the world. And my queerness lets me see a better academia and a better field. Namely, my queerness lets me be unapologetic that I am a squeaky wheel on a misshapen cart. So, also, if you feel like answering this in the chat, what has given you the power to be unapologetic? Or what have you seen that spoke in your voice and made you want to be unapologetic? Because of time, I had to cut my example of Janelle Monáe's massive influence on me. She helped me come out not with my sexuality, I had already done that, but with owning my queerness in the world. But being unapologetic is still painful. I've had enough privilege to not need to be confrontational for a large portion of my life, and it's been painful to be viewed as confrontational now. Kind of viewed as the angry, loud, queer person of color. It doesn't make me feel seen by any means. But now that I don't hide, and now that I don't hide pieces of myself, other pieces are hidden for me by others. They hear the squeaking wheel that rubs against this infrastructure and it discomforts them, so they hide the fact that I'm gentle, that I'm kind, and these are things that I've always cherished about myself. And this pain specifically is not pain I can fix externally. This needs self-acceptance. And so now I'd like to read something. This is from Ruth Gendler's The Book of Qualities. It's a really, really lovely book. And it just personifies all these qualities. And the quality I want to share with you right now is this: courage. Courage has roots. She sleeps on a futon on the floor and lives close to the ground. Courage looks you straight in the eye. She is not impressed with power trippers and she knows first aid. Courage is not afraid to weep and she is not afraid to pray, even when she is not sure who she is praying to. When courage walks, it is clear that she has made the journey from loneliness to solitude. The people who told me she is stern were not lying. They just forgot to mention that she is kind. And narratives are important, so I'll just, to end this, lay out kind of this narrative here. My slides are going to be on the left, essentially. The first thing is defining what queer is. I had to do that for myself. And what happened there was feelings, just lots of feelings and confusion. And then from there, once I had a sense of being outside the lines, whose lines was something I pictured. And for me, that was actually very validating. I was able to validate those feelings. And I'm so grateful to the queer community in the Bay Area for helping me through this stage. And then comes the shattering of worldviews and role models and institutions in ways that are not meant to give you room to change them. And to me, this was just systemic, infrastructural, institutional pain. But you know, um, in the face of massive systemic forces that marginalize my voice and all the gaslighting and mental gymnastics that go with that, I had to learn to be unapologetic in using my voice. And I'll call that self-acknowledgement here. It's kind of acknowledging that I can see something and that it's worth saying. Um, and then being unapologetically voiced, I have the ways I'd be isolated for that. And know that that space is my choice. And this is kind of this loneliness to solitude that seems to be a theme of this. And one thing I'm still learning, at least within academia, and I'm so excited for that it is within academia, that there's some good community to be had at the margins, even within academia. This journey from loneliness to solitude does not have to be alone. That you can be alone together, and can have, instead of self-acceptance, a collective acceptance. And the fact that I felt so isolated for my views in academia, only to connect with a queer POC in academia and be completing each other's sentences, and the fact that I'm not the only one that put a poem in their talk, and the fact that Shakir's talk lined up so well with mine, even before I knew their script. Their word choices, solitude and loneliness. I've heard this a few times throughout this already. And just, seeing these pluses and minuses kind of pop in tells me that this collective acceptance is already happening. And this journey isn't linear and it's not comprehensive, but I think these are landmarks many of us will pass or have passed, and we may, or revisit. And we may be all at different points in this journey, but I am just so excited to write this next piece with you, right? This queering of machine learning. Because kind of as BC said, we have so much power in this area, and our existence is already changing the fabric of the field. And this lets us have collective action. I'm still grieving the academia that I thought I could be a part of, but I can't wait to dream up a better one with y'all.